Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining me. Late last night, Virginia lost a great statesman. Our country lost a leader that reflected the best of public service. And I lost a dear friend and mentor. John Warner, who served our country in so many ways, who volunteered to join the Navy at 18 at the end of World War II, subsequently joined the Marines in the Korean War, practiced law, became involved in politics in Virginia, became Secretary of the Navy, head of the bicentennial, and then in a circuitous, interesting path in 1978, got first elected to the United States Senate, where he served for 5 terms, serving at one point as chair of the Armed Services Committee, and other years as vice chair, serving on the Intelligence Committee, where he also became the vice chairman. And I had the honor of taking his seat when he decided not to run for a 6th term in 2008. I would have never really expected my relationship with John and to turn into something as important as it did to me, to my family, to whatever success I may have had in my public life. I always saw John Warner as a role model. I think for some of you who may not be having been covered Virginia for a long time, I say this because I kind of got my start in Virginia politics when I actually ran against John Warner in 1996. John Warner was already at that point beloved, bipartisan leader. He had the courage in the years around 1993, 94, to stand up to forces in the Republican Party at that point, Oliver North, who were trying to take the Republican Party off the main street, and John Warner stood up to that. And he paid a price for a while in terms of some disagreements inside the Republican Party. I decided I was going to run against him as a relatively new high-tech business guy out of Northern Virginia. It was an interesting but respectful race. Confused the heck out of most Virginians, Warner versus Warner. And I've told this story to many, but it was absolutely true. We had a bumper strip that said, "Mark, not John." And one time campaigning in Danville, people saw the bumper strip and asked me whether that was a biblical reference. John Warner loved that bumper strip. He kept it as well. And one of the things that I so appreciate now that I didn't really at that point is when you run against someone, especially if you are have been as successful as John Warner, to have an upstart like me run against him, to have the kind of heart that he did after the election, because I do think Virginians picked the right Warner in re-electing John. He was still willing to allow me to become his friend. I remember one of the first times visiting him in his Senate office, and it was bits and pieces of his career. That friendship that we started to develop in the late 90s really blossomed when I became governor. And whether it was early on in my first year when we took on the ill-fated transportation referendums, John Warner was willing to stand up against conventional political wisdom, or maybe even what was in his own best political interest. But he supported our efforts to raise funding in Northern Virginia, Hampton Roads. We got our butts beat in both cases in those referendums, but he stuck by me and stuck by those policies throughout that effort. A few years later, in 2004, we were trying to build a bipartisan approach to fix our long-term finances in Virginia. And while I had a number of great allies in the General Assembly and Richmond, Republican allies, John Warner decided that he would weigh in. And I can remember we snuck him in to the Capitol, up to the governor's office, and talked about how we were going to conduct the campaign to try to make sure that we could fix Virginia's finances. And I remember John then going up to the third floor in the old press room, and it was kind of like Zeus arriving, and he would thundered, politics be damned, we have to do what's right for Virginia. And together we did what was right for Virginia. Obviously, there are literally millions of Virginians that served in our military, current or veterans, who benefited from John Warner's leadership, particularly as chairman of the Armed Services Committee, where he was always there to defend the Navy. And I know how proud he was and his wonderful wife Jeannie were of the USS submarine, the John Warner, that got commissioned in his name. And I remember going to that commissioning, have the honor of speaking, and you could see the pride that he felt that his beloved Navy was honoring him with that ship. I tell you, in Northern Virginia, I live in Alexandria. I look out my window and I'm close to the waterfront and see the Woodrow Wilson Bridge. Again, a bridge that had been decaying for many, many years, a bottleneck, not just for Northern Virginia, but for the whole DMV area. It was John Warner that figured out the way to get that bridge built and funded. As years went on, after John decided that he was not going to seek re-election, I ran for that seat. I told him, having run against him once, I would never run against him again. If he wanted to continue to serve, I'd be happy to support him. But he decided to step down. And particularly in those first few years, virtually every few weeks, I would sit with him and try to get his counsel. In 2014, I was proud to receive his endorsement. He being a Republican, I'm a Democrat. I think I was the first Democrat he actually fully endorsed. He endorsed other Democrats subsequently to that. But I remember him and I traveling, particularly up and down the valley. And nobody knew how to campaign like John Warner. He was always dressed to the nines. I mean, he looked like he stepped sometimes right out of a Hunt Country magazine. But I particularly remember a trip all up and down the valley where we would swap stories, and our friend Tim Kaine would sometimes come along as well. And no one could command the stage like John Warner. More recently, he was kind enough to endorse me again in the 2020 campaign. I remember one event where it was a fundraiser, and he came to speak, and he introduced me. I gave my spiel, and then he took his cane and whacked me in the leg and said, "Mark, you sit down again. I've got a few more things to say." And then got up and spent 30 minutes telling war stories that really held the whole crowd in a way where folks really felt like they got their money's worth that night. John cared so much about Virginia. He cared so much about our country. He cared so much about the United States Senate. And again, during the period of Donald Trump, he was so worried about where our country was headed. He saw what kind of person Donald Trump was and was willing to speak out on that, following in that tradition of always putting Virginia first. And as he said, politics be damned, let's do what's right for the country in Virginia. Last saw him just a few weeks ago. He was frail, but I would try to regularly go over and visit with him. And he was still very concerned about his beloved Senate, wanted to make sure there were still chances for bipartisanship. And I told him that, we were going to keep slugging and we were going to get some things done. He would have been so proud of the bill we're working on right now, where we're trying to deal with national security. We're trying to take on in a thoughtful way the challenges around China. We're trying to make investments long-term in terms of our technology capabilities around semiconductors. It was the kind of legislation that John Warner would have always been part of. There are so many stories I could tell about John. I know Rachel's here is trying to move me along, so I'll move to questions. But he was an original. There were things that John Warner could say in his voice and tenor that virtually any other elected official, if they said it, might sound kind of over the top. Coming out of John Warner, it always sounded dignified, respectful, and thoughtful. I'm going to miss him terribly. So many Virginians, I know he touched their lives in so many ways. He exemplified everything in my mind that was special about the Virginia way. I know some people say there's not a Virginia way anymore. Well, John Warner reflected that ability to disagree with somebody without being disagreeable, the absolute commitment to Virginia and our country first. And I was proud to call him a mentor. I was proud to follow him. I will never succeed him. I will simply follow him. And I was proud to call him a dear friend. And I will miss him greatly, miss his counsel, and miss his laugh, miss that twinkle in his eye. I don't know if any of you all have questions, but I'd be happy to take some questions.
Yep, we have our first question from Santiago from WFXR.
Good morning, Senator. Thank you. I wanted to ask you about Reality Winner's case. In 2017, James Comey wrote a memo saying that he wanted to nail a leaker to the door to send a message. And in recent months, there's been growing support for Reality Winner to be pardoned and released from prison. And in 2017, you said, quote, whoever's the leaker should be pursued to the full extent of the law. Is that still your position on her case?
So I'm not really sure what you're referencing. I'll be happy to take a look at that. I'm here to talk about John Warner today.
Our next question is from...
Good morning, Senator. Thank you for taking time with us. If there's just a memory, a story, something you could recount for us of an interaction that you had with John that you could share by chance?
Well, there are so many stories that I can recount. I remember so many times when I was governor where we, it was his counsel on, how to navigate the legislature. I remember a few years back, John and I did a joint appearance at University of Virginia, and in I think one of Larry Sabato's classes, and we did a presentation, and my wife Lisa and a couple of my daughters went out with John and his longtime Chief of Staff Susan McGill and John's brother, and John told some of the stories of some of his younger days at W&L, and let's put it like how he and his sometimes his brother was always the designated driver, and a group of college guys running around. Probably shouldn't tell those stories, but it would suffice it to say it was great for my daughters to hear him recounting that. It was great to have him tell stories of so many figures from history that he intersected with. It was. I think he was proud of me, but he also, he was always going to be the senior guy, and he never let me forget that. And he would even, he in his later years had a walking stick, and if we were at an event together, and I was going on a little bit too long, he was not shy about slightly whacking my knees and saying, Mark, let me get back up and talk. And then he was always quite charming there. I think a lot about how we, back in 2005 with the BRAC process, and there was a concern that, Oceana, could be in jeopardy. And John came into our meeting John and I and George Allen, I was governor, they were both the senators, and he had a whole yellow pad full of notes on how we could protect Oceana, make the case, preserve those jobs, but also more importantly, preserve that defense capacity. I also know that in his later years, he acknowledged that the world was changing, and while he'd always been a great defender of our Navy, he understood the challenges that came from cyber. He understood the challenges that came from asymmetrical warfare. He understood the value of and importance of our overhead architecture in terms of satellites. For somebody that was, even after he'd served, and I'm talking about now, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, he was still kept very current on how the character of our defense posture had to change. I can, remember one of our first debates, when I was running against him, and after the debate, as opposed to the kind of, it was at the Homestead, I believe it was that year, as opposed to the Greenbrier, but as opposed to both candidates kind of going to lick the wounds after we had the debate, there was some hall where there were a series of exhibits, and he and I walked around the hall and looked at a bunch of exhibits. You don't do that in politics these days, and I, now that I'm kind of the senior senator, the idea of being willing to kind of build a relationship with someone who'd been trying to take your job away, was, again, I think, a reflection of the kind of man he was. That he was, the campaign was over. It was time for us to be friends. I do know. Let me tell you one quick story that's kind of fun. We would always go to the shad planking, and as the shad planking got more and more years went on, it became much more of a Republican event. It had originally been a Democratic event. And I remember one time I was flying down into Wakefield, and John was flying down, and the Republican Women's Club of around Wakefield was having a reception for John Warner at the little airport. My plane happened to land first, though, and the guys working at the airport announced, "Well, Warner's here." And so all the Republican Women's Club come out and get all ready to cheer. You ought to have seen their faces completely fall when they realized, oh my gosh, this is the wrong Warner. This is the guy that's running against John. We laughed about that one a number of times. And as I said, he loved making the same kind of jokes about the Warner versus Warner. And as time went on, Mark not John, or he would sometimes call it was John not Mark. But there were so many times we spent together, and he was so generous with his spirit. He was generous to folks who worked with him. He was beloved by his staff. I was lucky enough to keep some of his staff. I remember the first guy who traveled with me when I was first senator was somebody who had traveled with John the last year or two, and he would tell stories of how John did it on his own time, and particularly on some of the back roads of Virginia, whenever there was an antique store, he would stop and wander through the store. And again, I think he got to a lot of political dinners a bit late, but he really collected a lot of memorabilia from all over the Commonwealth.
I think that's it for questions. The senator has to run off to the Senate floor to make a joint speech with Senator Tim.
But let me just, John Warner exemplified what a life of public service should be about. He joined the military at 18. He rejoined the Marines after World War II to serve in the Korean War. He served as Secretary of the Navy. He served in the U.S. Attorney's Office. He obviously served as United States Senator, and was always that person willing to meet folks he disagreed with halfway. And his spirit is something I've oftentimes when I'm wrestling with an issue or problem, I try to think about what would John Warner do. And if I kind of follow that in my heart, I know I'm headed in the right direction for Virginia and for our country. Boy, we're all going to miss him. Thank you all.
Thank you again for